One of his so-called master arguments is so powerful that surely Sextus must have given up on the actual search for truth. The ancient philosophers are killing themselves because they can't solve a logical puzzle.
The Stoics, they're crazy people, okay? They're seeing their dead kids and they're laughing. They're in tranquil joy.
If you really think the true religion will justify biting off your tongue, killing yourself if you can't solve a puzzle,
you better make sure that's right.
You better make sure that's right. Sextus and Augustine did it first, and Descartes is a copycat. There's very little original in Descartes.
Not only does Sextus do it first, he does it better.
Living a conventional life, as he claims to do, makes you the prisoner of convention. Why do we think slavery is fine? Well, because everybody thinks slavery is fine. Some folks say incest is good, some folks say incest is bad. Well, I guess we can't decide.
Sextus flips our intuitions on its head.
Without being able to justify his views, he found tranquility all the same.
Many of us got into philosophy because we hoped it would improve our lives. We think that getting at some kind of foundational truth about the world will finally make us happy. But Sextus Empiricus, one of the great ancient skeptics, thinks that this drive does more harm than good. Because so often, belief that one has found this capital T truth leads to alienation from society, disruption of convention, and living ridiculous lifestyles. In Sextus's time, some ancient philosophers would kill themselves because they couldn't solve a logical puzzle. And a modern equivalent would be religious terrorism, right? This unjustified fanaticism because you think you have the capital T truth. My guest today is Cornell's Tad Brennan, a legendary scholar of ancient skepticism. And in this interview, you're going to learn how to cure yourself of philosophy, the alternative path to obtaining happiness and tranquility, and the various methods and master arguments Sextus employed to destroy the other philosophical schools he encountered. Who is Sextus Empiricus, and what are the core tenets of his philosophy?
Sextus was a Greek author of probably around 200 to 250 AD, working under the Roman Empire. He describes himself as a Pyrrhonian philosopher, and in his view, a Pyrrhonian is someone who is engaged in an ongoing search for the truth. On his telling, all philosophers start out searching for the truth, but then some of them think that they have found it. They've got the complete, final, and unrevisable answer. And those he calls just straightforward dogmatists. And they would include people like Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus, the Stoics, and so on. Others, he says, have concluded from their search that the truth cannot be discovered, that it's impossible to discover the truth. And those he thinks are just as dogmatic as the first group. He calls them academic skeptics and dogmatists of a secondary sort. And about himself, he says, well, look, we haven't found the truth. We've not concluded that the truth is unfindable. We're simply still in the process of searching. So that's his self-characterization. He's somebody who's searching for the truth. But the method that he employs in searching for the truth is to examine the books and theories of his predecessors. So he's got what must have been a considerable and extensive library of ancient Greek philosophy. And he pores over the writings of earlier philosophers and attempts to challenge the tenets of their schools. And in particular, he will challenge the tenets of their schools either by pointing to internal incoherencies within the school or by pitting one school against another, by saying that the one school has counter-arguments against the first school. He also has some general modes that he uses in order to cause you to doubt whether the dogmatic schools have really accomplished what they claim to have accomplished. Things like familiar skeptical arguments against the reliability of the senses, familiar relativistic arguments against the prejudices of one culture as opposed to another. All these things he thinks ought to give us doubt about whether the truth has been discovered yet.
Right. And one thing perhaps to add from your book is that he started pursuing truth because he wanted, among other things, tranquility. And yet, even though he has not discovered the capital T truth, he has received this kind of tranquility. And that's what I found so fascinating and applicable to not just my own life, but a lot of our lives, which is he's claiming in a very contrarian way So first of all, he's attacking philosophical schools, right?
Yeah.
Dogmas,
Yeah.
and letting ordinary opinions, those everyday opinions that you and I have, a lot of them slip by.
Seems to.
And also, he's claiming that tranquility doesn't come from grasping at the truth, but he gets it without getting at the truth, right? And so that's what I find extremely fascinating about your treatment of Sextus.
Well, he thinks that people who pursue philosophy, himself included, do so out of a dissatisfaction with the difficulty in understanding the world. The world's just puzzling. It's hard to make it all add up. It's hard to provide scientific explanations for phenomena. It's hard to get a good account of how ethics works. How should we treat other people? There are a million puzzles to be thought about. And on his account, he began, as all other philosophers do, with the belief that he could only find tranquility, he could only find peace of mind by resolving all these unanswered questions. Had to get the answers. And if he didn't get the answers, then tranquility would never appear. So it was much to his surprise, he says, that in fact, instead of finding the answers, what he found was that for every answer that was put forward by some school, there was an equally good counter-argument, which, in his view, leaves him, and ought to leave you, in a state of what he calls equipoise or equipollence, equality of considerations for and against. Just as much to be said on one side of the matter as the other. Are there Platonic forms? Are there Epicurean atoms? Well, there's a lot to be said in favor of it, but there's an equal amount to be said against it. The problem is not yet resolved, but he says that in his experience, somehow, tranquility has flowed from the very experience of equipollence,
right?
From the very fact that his mind is in a perfect balance between the options.
Right. And that is the mystery I want to investigate in this entire this interview. Yeah, go ahead. You wanted to say something.
Feel free to investigate, but there's not a lot to be said about it. That he himself, I think, eschews any analysis of how it comes out. I mean,
right.
he says that it happens rather accidentally. He has this.
It's just a report. It's just a self-report. Hey, this happened to me.
There's that, right? There's also, he offers us this little parable about the Greek painter Apelles, actually a well-known painter, who was laboriously trying to get the foam, the representation of foam on a horse's mouth just right. And after many efforts at getting how it should look, he gave up in despair and threw his sponge at the painting. And then to his amazement, the print of the sponge produced exactly the effect of foam that he'd been striving to accomplish. So that's at least a parable, but it doesn't really give us a roadmap.
Right, a causal explanation.
Doesn't give us a causal explanation, doesn't really give us an algorithm for how to do it. I mean, after all, if you were to say to Apelles, so wait, is that how I should make foam when I next want to make foam? He probably would not say, oh, it's guaranteed. He'd say, well, yeah,
it worked for me.
It worked for me. Yeah, that's all I can report.
Right.
And as you said, this is Sextus's own report of his own experience. So far as, I mean, the closest we get to a causal count or causal explanation is just the claim that this follows from equipollence, this follows from equality of reasons pro and con, but no more than that.
I see. Before we investigate what he's trying to attack, dogmas, how he tries to attack them, equipollence, and what results, right, this tranquility, I want to start with the why question. Why bother attacking these things in the first place? And I want to begin with a fascinating quote from your book.
Okay.
The self-induced disturbances of the dogmatists are found throughout the pages of antiquity. For instance, there was the Pythagorean who bit out her own tongue rather than violate the school's prohibition against eating legumes. There was Philetus of Kos who drove himself to death because he could not solve the liar paradox. There was the dialectician who killed himself because he could not resolve a sophistical puzzle. There was the Cyrenaics, persuaded to kill themselves by Hegesias until the local authorities closed his school as a health hazard. On the other side of irrational elation, one need only consider the state of the proper Stoic who watches his children being tortured with a feeling of tranquil joy at the progress of the cosmos, or the state of the Epicurean who, instead of feeling pained at the death of a close friend, delights in the reflection that he can always find other friends just as hedonically useful. Tell us about the crazy people that Sextus was writing against, right? I think that this part of the context is very important of why Sextus developed this seemingly offensive theory, right?
Yeah, Sextus thinks that all of his opponents, the dogmatic philosophers, began with a perfectly sensible and sympathetic objective. So they wanted to figure out how to live well. They wanted to find an art of living. They wanted also to understand the universe, but they thought these two would go hand in hand, that scientific knowledge and ethical knowledge would go hand in hand. And they thought in particular that the way that we normally live, the way that ordinary people, non-philosophers, live, has some obvious shortcomings. People are too susceptible to different kinds of emotional upset. Their lives are too chaotic, not rationally planned, and so, by contrast, the philosophers are going to offer you a really well organized, rational life. And his claim is that although that's what they advertise, in fact, by the time they get to developing their increasingly counterintuitive theories, they wind up being committed to living lives that are not at all attractive. They're, in fact, less attractive than the lives of ordinary people. They actually have taken on board, through their philosophical commitments, greater turmoil, greater lack of tranquility than what ordinary people have. So they sought tranquility. They thought they'd get it by developing the grand theory of everything. They developed their grand theory of everything, and they wind up with even less tranquility than your ordinary person at the grocery store or woman on the bus.
Right.
That's why he wants to emphasize some of these extreme and to sometimes shocking views that some of the ancient philosophers had.
Right.
Now, it's a bit of a caricature. I had to search pretty hard to find that many cases of deep psychopathy in the annals of ancient philosophy. Because for every one of these nuts who are killing themselves because they can't solve a logical puzzle, there are also 10 other philosophers who are more or less conventional, who may even have been benefited by philosophy. But Sextus wants to focus on the ones for whom philosophy itself has become a new source of untranquility, a new source of turmoil.
Right. When we look at these cases, I think there's these caricatural cases that you had to work hard to discover. I think a lot of people would feel derision, but I almost feel a degree of respect, because at the very least, they're taking their philosophy seriously.
Oh, aren't they? Yes.
Right. And I think it's a reminder, I think, of how at arm's length, maybe even modern philosophers take their philosophies, right? As, for example, a historian of philosophy, you're kind of investigating a puzzle without it affecting your life. And I studied with a lot of historians of philosophy, and for them, it's just solving a logical puzzle, right? Like a math question. But these people took philosophy seriously, literally, maybe a bit overly so in this case. But that's what I found so refreshing about this period of time.
Absolutely. So they did take it very seriously. And I think in Sextus's view, that's the right attitude to have if you happen to be in possession of the truth.
Right.
But that's also why any claims to be in possession of the truth have to be subjected to the greatest scrutiny.
Right.
That if you really think that the true religion, so to speak, will justify you in whatever it may be, biting off your tongue, killing yourself if you can't solve a puzzle.
You better make sure that's right.
You better make sure that's right, yeah. And so that's the other reason why part of his characterization of the dogmatists is that they're all involved in something that's rash and premature.
Right.
They're all jumping to conclusions without really having thought it through well enough. So Sextus himself might, in principle, not have any objection to the idea that if you really did have the ultimate theory of everything, then you ought to live by it, and you ought to follow its dictates, even to what look like counterintuitive
extreme degrees, right?
Yeah.
But I did want to emphasize that I think there's an attractive core about this mode of living, even if I side with Sextus here. Now,
well, so it's clearly attractive. I mean, lots of folks nowadays do want to turn to ancient philosophy, and Stoicism in particular, to provide them with a different way to live. I think this is deeply misguided myself, and I'm among the historians that you mentioned who don't follow the people that I study. I am super interested in the ancient philosophers, but my life is extremely conventional. My life is boringly bourgeois. You would not find much difference in how I live from how anyone else lives.
Right. Maybe you're a true sexton then, right? Because he's also for this ordinary.
I will say, I think in a certain sense, I do have more sympathy for Sextus's view that, look, we'd all like some
grand theory.
Some grand theory. We'd all like, one simple trick for living the ideal life. But in the absence of that, it's not clear that anybody's come up with anything better than relatively mundane, ordinary, conventional life.
Is that how you think about this? Like how you treat, like why you treat historical philosophy as a puzzle to be solved and not as a way to live? Because you've been convinced by Sextus?
I think, honestly, I think some of it may have rubbed off on me. Yeah, I generally don't think of myself as somebody who really follows arguments much at all. I don't live in a rational way. Right. So it's not as though I read Sextus and became convinced and then arrived at this conclusion. But I do think that in a non-rational way, part of his attitude rubbed off on me. That if along with Sextus, you read hundreds of ancient arguments from dozens of ancient philosophers, you do start spotting the moves. You do start saying, yeah, okay, I can see why that's plausible, but on the other hand, here's a counter move. Right. And it does, I think, tend to undermine my, at least,
conviction too. Yeah,
or even temptation to find an allegiance. Even the search for the master science. So, this, I think, is, generally a mistake. I think people ought not to be looking for new and novel ways to live. Not to say that there's anything so great about the boring, conventional, bourgeois, suburban life I live. That may be far from optimal. But if something's going to come along and do better, it's got to show me the bona fides. It's got to prove its case.
When Sextus attacks these dogmatic systems, is it because they are wrong, right? An epistemic issue he has with it? Or is it an ethical issue that they lead to bad lives?
Right. Well, so to begin with, he's probably not going to say that they are wrong, since that would involve his expressing the view that the contradictory was right.
Yes.
So he's going to say instead that there are equally opposed arguments and considerations on both sides.
Right.
But when he attacks them, his formal stance is that he wakes up every day fully open to the possibility that today he'll find a philosophical view that cannot be countered. Today he's going to find the truth. And today he's going to find this bit of truth that he's been searching for, and he'll be delighted. Now, that is his official position. That's built into the definition of what it is to be a Pyrrhonian skeptic. But many of my colleagues in the business, many people who read Sextus, don't find that plausible. They don't see how he could really conduct the systematic investigations of other philosophers that he does with the results that he produces, namely total failure, abject failure across
every
the board.
Single time, right.
Every single time, he's always able to find a counter-argument that's of equal and opposite value. How could he do that and not, at some point, by induction, if nothing else, just come to the conclusion that, tomorrow's not going to be any different. It's going to be the same old story. Well, maybe that's right, but if it is right, that would be an unfortunate inconsistency in his own self-presentation. He does not say, I'm somebody who has arrived at the conclusion that the truth is not to be found.
Right.
Quite the opposite. He distinguishes himself from the academic skeptics in exactly those terms. They're the ones who concluded the truth cannot be found. I'm still searching.
I see.
So, again, as a formal matter, as a matter of his own self-presentation, every morning he wakes up and says, let's find the truth.
Yeah.
Maybe it's in this book.
Let me ask the question a different way. You said, thanks for correcting me. When he takes issue with these philosophies, the method he uses, which we're going to talk about later, equipollence, is an epistemic mode of attack, right? That like your philosophy has not given me more reason to believe than this opposing philosophy.
Yep.
In this book, in the quote and the caricatures that you pulled out about these crazy people biting their tongues off, that seems to be an ethical concern about the consequence of these philosophy. So maybe I can frame the thought experiment this way, which is, what would Sextus do to a philosophy that was clearly epistemically wrong or was held in equipollence, that he didn't have a reason to believe it, that clearly benefited people from ordinary life, right? So a Christian might say, even if belief in the Christian God is unjustified, it makes better lives. And what would he say to a philosophy that, let's say, he determined was right, but clearly led to terrible ethical consequences. I'm trying to tease out here, like which prong of the problem is more primary for him.
So I do think that he thinks the ethics is a secondary question,
Right.
and that insofar as he thinks of himself as a philosopher, he's first and foremost interested in the truth, and interested in the truth for its own sake, and also the truth of the other positions, the dogmatic positions that he investigates. So, so one of your hypotheses was, would he decline to attack a system were he persuaded that it was pragmatically advantageous? No, I don't think so, and that for two reasons. So I think he would still attack it. One, because it's just what he does. That's what makes him a Pyrrhonian skeptic.
Right.
Two, because I think that among the things that he would attack would be the claim of pragmatic advantage. Somebody has come to him and said, I tell you what, go easy on us, okay? I mean, I admit our system has some flaws, but look at the rewards. Look at the payoff, right? I think that claim itself is going to be subject to skeptical investigation. Tell me about the payoff. Is it really guaranteed? And payoff in what terms? Why should we think that those are the terms of pragmatic advantage? Why should we think that that's really a good bargain? So when it's presented to him in this way, namely, our system may be false, but it has advantages 1 through 4, that becomes new fodder for skeptical investigation.
Although it seems like he doesn't have problem with the reverse claim that these theories have pragmatical negative consequences, right? That's the quote that you listed. So if he doesn't subject those to skeptical attack, surely the reverse he should also let go, right? If he's willing to say, look at the Stoics, they're crazy people, okay? They're seeing their dead kids and they're laughing, like they're in tranquil joy. If he's willing to make a claim about that negative consequence, surely he's willing to accept the claim that, you know, believing in some God, benevolent God, is good for life, even if it's false, right?
Great. I agree with you that his attitude to both of these should be the same. That is, his attitude to alleged advantages and to the alleged disadvantages should be the same. I think it is. Namely, you know, when I constructed that list of, you know, wacky self-harmers from the ancients, that's not a list that Sextus composes, but he would say that the dogmatists create more disturbance, more lack of tranquility for themselves through their own dogma than they actually solve. There, I think he's probably going to be saying that in a way that he thinks is not his own commitment, but is internal to his opponent's commitment. So I think he's going to say, by their own lights, they ought to see that these are consequences they're not willing to accept.
I see.
So again, this is characteristic of Sextus. He believes that he's always going to be arguing from his opponent's premises. So he doesn't have any commitments. He's not stating his own positions. He's just working with the views of other people and either saying, hey, you Epicureans, your views are internally inconsistent. You Epicureans yourselves shouldn't accept these views. Or, hey, you Epicureans, you and the Stoics fight. Right, let's have an argument between the two of you, and then any neutral observer will agree that neither one has made their case. But I myself, Sextus, even though I'm conducting this fight, I'm not myself taking a stand in it.
I see.
So I think he believes, you know, back to our self-harmers. I think he believes that he merely needs to hold these people up. Look at these examples. And he doesn't have to render a judgment on whether those are bad consequences or good consequences.
I see.
He can just say, these claims of good consequences are counterposed to claims of bad consequences.
I see. This is fascinating. So there actually is a bit of asymmetry between the practical good consequences and bad consequences in the following sense.
Okay.
In the case when you claim this is a bad consequence, right? When he claims it's a bad consequence on their own grounds, that is end of his critical investigation, because he shows you on your own imminent terms how it doesn't work.
Okay.
But if you say, look, my theory is great on the good consequences side, then he can start critiquing the basis of those of the standard, right? So he has to go one layer deeper to critique that theory. So there's a slight asymmetry, but your point still stands, which is he's still just about getting the equipollence set up in one way or the other. It's about where he attacks.
I think that's right. Yeah, and often when you read secondary literature on Sextus, people will describe him as working dialectically. So the whole idea that this is a dialectical stance on his part means he's not necessarily committed to the premises from which he argues. He is borrowing them merely for the purpose of refutation. That's always, again, this is another source of scholarly controversy. Is this a coherent way to conduct business? Is it possible to do this all the way down? So, for instance, I can juxtapose Stoics to Epicureans and maybe show that they're contradictory without myself being committed to either view. Can I do that without being committed to the law of non-contradiction?
Right. Yeah.
Can I do any of this without being committed to simple logical inference? After all, he himself uses logical inferences like modus ponens all the time. Is he thereby committed to the validity of certain argumentative modes? Can you really conduct anything like Sextus's activities in a completely commitment-free way?
Right.
And again, some scholars read him as having successfully pulled that off. Some say, nope, he winds up ultimately being committed to this or that.
I see. So we talked about why, right? Why he's attacking it, and the conclusion is the primary thing is epistemic. Right, the practical consequences is secondary. It's another argumentative tool. Primarily, as a philosopher, he's out there investigating what is true. Before we talk about the method, right, equipollence and how, I want to talk about what he's actually in the business of attacking. Because he actually, in your reading, buckets off a lot of ordinary beliefs as being freed from attack. And so, let me give you a quote again from your book.
Yeah.
The Sextan skeptic will have a different attitude towards the Epicurean philosopher's claim that there are atoms and a 20th century schoolchild's utterance of the same words. The Epicurean offers justifications for their belief, and the belief has a certain status and role within their comprehensive system. None of this is true of a schoolchild. The child offers no justifications at all for believing it, other than his teachers having said so. But it is just this fact that makes the child an ineligible target for the Sextan skeptic altogether. What's so incredible here is that Sextus flips our intuitions on its head. It's the unjustified belief that I will not investigate and attack, and it's the one who claims that he has justification. That's the one I want to attack. Is that right?
That's at least how I read Sextus. He does say these funny things, both about the nature of the dogma that he's targeting, and also about how he lives his own life. And he says that he lives in accordance with traditional customs. He lives in accordance with the natural promptings of his own constitution. So he says, when I get hungry, it's not like I start asking myself skeptical questions about whether I'm hungry or not. I just go get some food. So then we have to figure out, from these relatively scant comments of this nature, how do we provide a principled articulation of this distinction between what he thinks is fair game for skeptical challenge and what he thinks is somehow exempt from skeptical challenge? What he means by dogma, the dogmata that he attacks when coming from his philosophical opponents. He thinks that these people have certain views which they take to be at least a provisional contribution to the ultimate story of everything there is. So if you're a Platonist, you'll be happy to admit you don't have everything worked out, but you are entirely confident that the ultimate story is going to have forms. So you're committed to the existence of forms. Ditto if you're an Epicurean. If you're an Epicurean, you may be open-minded about this or that question, but there are definitely atoms. That's one of your foundational commitments. So this idea that as a philosopher, you've already worked out some of what's going to be in the ultimate book of truth. When you hold something, when you hold a view, as though it's going to be an unrevisable part of the ultimate book of truth, that's when it's a dogma for Sextus. So revisability, provisionality, non-fundamentality, these are the marks of what's not dogmatic in his view.
Right. And perhaps we can tie this back to the ethics and an epistemic concern that I asked when we talked about the why, which is it's also a bit more obvious why holding views in this dogmatic way can tend to lead to bad ethical consequences.
Certainly extreme ones.
Because you're a zealot, right, in some sense. You're a zealot. You're not willing to listen to anything else. And so I just wanted to point out there seems to be a nice bridge between this kind of holding of a view with negative ethical consequences.
Absolutely.
Now, I just want to be very, very clear here on this division, as clear as we possibly can.
Well, and again, we're always limited by the evidence.
Yes, we're limited by the evidence between dogma and ordinary belief. So dogma he attacks, ordinary belief he spares. When I read your book, there seems to be a few different ways to cut it. So you tell me what it is. The first divide is between systematicity versus singular observation. So a standalone claim versus a whole system. The second way to split it is infallible foundational criterion of truth versus a probable thing. It's probably likely. The third one is when you try to use reason, metaphysics, instead of things that are just sensible. And the last one is whether it's conventional or unconventional. So which one of these four cuts do you think captures the dogma versus ordinary belief divide?
Fair. So he certainly does use the word convention or the corresponding Greek word in outlining what he's willing to accept and willing to live by. So there is a sense in which things that are currently conventional get a pass just qua conventional. Just because they're conventional, they are not thereby subject to...
Hence the Adam example between the school child and Epicurean. Right, because the school child is conventional. We all think atoms exist, and that you just get a pass right there.
That's the idea. That's right. That's the hope behind using that example. Systematicity and foundational are all going to go together in that dogmata are held generally as part of a big system, and it's a big inferentially coherent system. The Greek philosophers were always interested in finding principles, sources, first causes, and the idea was everything's going to follow from that. So lots of their dogmata are either going to be dogmata about foundational issues or about the way that later things follow from the foundational issues. So that's going to be typical of dogmatic pronouncements. So those are going to be in there as well.
What about the sensual versus non-sensual, like reason versus the perception? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So there are really two different things you can do with perceptibles. You can treat them the way that non-philosophers do, as your basis for getting around in the world. You walk through the door and not through the window because the door is a better fit.
Right.
But there's this other thing that people do with perceptibles, in particular Epicureans and to some extent Stoics, which is to treat them as foundational. So if you're an empiricist, then you say that sense perception and the deliverances of sense perception are the basis for all possible knowledge, and we can build a strong foundation based on perception.
Right.
Now, all of a sudden, we're not using perception in the way that people in the grocery store use perception. Now we're using it in a dogmatic way.
I see.
Now it becomes fair game for attack.
Right.
Now Sextus is going to attack perception.
Right.
And the same is true with, you've mentioned religion a few times. The same is true with religion, that Sextus says explicitly, I follow the ordinary religious observances of my culture. Fine, no problem. But if somebody wants to say, oh, let me tell you about how God is the foundation of the entire universe, and God gives us the certainty and conviction of all truth.
The structure of the Trinity, yeah, exactly.
Whatever it may be, right? Or Zeus, right? In his era. Now, all of a sudden, you've laid yourself open for skeptical investigation because you're trying to do something foundational. You're trying to claim that this bit of opinion you have is an unrevisable part of the ultimate story of truth. I've already got a page out of the book. I may not have the whole book yet, but I've got a page out of it. And that's what triggers Sextus's bloodlust, right?
I like that word. So let me try to summarize your response to the four different options I gave you.
It wasn't good because it's hard to know exactly where to fit this in. And again, this is a matter of great controversy among scholars of Sextus. But run with it. Mm-hmm.
So the first one sounds like this is a problem, systematicity versus singular observation. If it's a whole system of everything, no bueno, right? You're trying to get at the foundational truths. Mm-hmm. Yes. The second one, infallible foundational truth versus probable, is also a problem. Like if you're claiming something is
Yes.
like atoms, even if it's not in a whole system.
Right.
That's still an issue.
Yep.
It sounds like it's a very interesting cut between, so originally I juxtaposed it between reason and empiricism, but it's more like both reason and empiricism can be used in a dogmatic way, or they can be used in a non-dogmatic, ordinary way. And so that's cut in a different way.
So can the probability. That is,
Right.
somebody could say, all right, so one person says, I'm not looking for infallibility. I just try to follow the odds the way they lead me. That's one thing. They might escape skeptical scrutiny. Somebody else says, I've got a theory of rational choice. I've got a theory of probabilistic decision-making. I'm going to tell you about Dutch book arguments. I'm going to tell you about how to conditionalize your views in a Bayesian way. All of a sudden, Sextus is going to get really interested in hassling this person about whether that's the right account of probability. Should they be a frequentist or should they be another kind of probability theorist? Because now probability itself has become a kind of dogma. And it becomes then subject to skeptical inquiry.
So the reason I brought these different cuts up was because obviously they don't neatly align with each other, right?
No.
And so for one example is something could be conventional, but be taken as an infallible truth.
You bet.
Like in Christian society, right? For 2,000 years, Jesus' resurrection is both conventional, but also infallible in this way. So how do we determine what is dogma and what is ordinary belief in these edge cases when these different cuts don't align together?
Yeah. So I don't think Sextus has a good answer to that question. How to make the cut extensionally, that is what things fall on one side or the other, and how to characterize the cut, what motivates it, what principles underlie it. It may well be that the cut should not be made in terms of content. That is, it's not as though you could write out a list of propositions and then divide it into two. It may be that it will be relative to holders. So we can take the very same belief content and one person will hold it dogmatically and another person will hold it
Like the atoms example between the Epicurean and the school
That's
child.
right. Not a difference of content, but a difference of how it's being held by the individual. Right.
I see.
And the same thing could go for the resurrection and the Trinity. Right. So there too, you could imagine two different people having different attitudes towards that.
I see. So even though almost everyone would say the resurrection, in Christian society, is infallible criterion of truth, Sextus could say a lot of people don't mean it, right? A lot of people don't actually hold it that way. They don't live their lives in accordance with the consequences of that. And so that almost escapes attack. It's something like that.
I think, that sort of thing. That's right. And this is going to be partly just because, as a professional controversialist, Sextus has no interest in beating up on amateurs. What's the fun in hassling people who are not professional philosophers?
Right.
So
punching below your weight. Yeah,
exactly. Punching below your weight. Yeah. So that's part of why he's going to go after the accredited theologian and not just the pious old woman at the church. Because there's no fun in beating up on people.
I see. So let's do this another way. I'm going to give a series of statements, and you can tell me if you think they're dogmatic or not.
Great. Okay.
The first one is I'm talking with Professor Brennan right now.
Right.
Is that dogmatic?
Again, there are ways of saying that in a completely undogmatic way, and there are ways of making that. I don't know if you've encountered G.E. Moore's article about skepticism, against skepticism. So he makes a statement like that, namely, here's one hand and here's another. He uses those statements as the basis of a complete refutation of skepticism, refutation, which he thinks is a successful refutation of radical Cartesian-style skepticism about the external world. If Sextus heard you saying, you're chatting with me in this room, etc., and if he thought that you were doing it in a Moorean style as the starting point for a definitive refutation of skepticism, then I think he would say, great, let's go to work. Now I've got some issues with that statement.
Right. Okay. What if I said something like, all men are mortal, Socrates is man, Socrates is mortal? There's clearly a way where this is dogmatic, right? But is there a non-dogmatic way of using syllogistic logic?
Sextus is not going to object to the fact that in ordinary life we make lots of inferences. I ask you, where's the broccoli? And you say, well, it's a vegetable, isn't it? And I go look in the vegetable bin. Now, clearly there was some inferential thought in my mind that connected your saying it's a vegetable, isn't it, to my looking in the vegetable bin. So I was doing some inference, and that's just a human thing. So I don't think that has to be dogmatic, but of course it can be. I mean, if you're writing Aristotle's prior analytics and setting out a systematic theory of formal inference, then he's going to ask you about how that works.
Let's push this a bit further. Let's go to the realm of theoretical construction. And here, obviously, it can be done dogmatically, but I wonder if it can be done non-dogmatically. And I'll give you an example, economics. You could very well think, the laws of supply and demand and the different charts that you use, this is a tool that I'm going to use to try to get a rough idea of the overall behavior, knowing full well that this does not capture some ontological reality. In that case, is that okay? Ordinary belief or dogma?
Yeah, fair. What do we say? I think we certainly would characterize certain people as dogmatic market theorists.
Of course, yes.
And when we say that, and then we might characterize someone else as somebody who, uses the models, thinks they can give us some insight, maybe give us some policy guidance, but doesn't think they're part of the ultimate story. I'm inclined to say that he would treat the one who thought that supply and demand curves are part of the ultimate story of everything as engaged in dogma.
Yep, of course.
The one who was running a grocery shop and decided to raise the price of wheat because they heard that the wheat import had all sunk at sea, they would not be acting dogmatically.
I see.
So that's my guess.
Yeah, so you can draw inferences and even engage in some kind of low-level philosophy, right? Because there are some philosophy, like think about Plato's arguments for virtue in the Euthydemus, right? How he just says, well, let's look at health. Well, can more health hurt you? Yes. And can more wealth hurt you? Yes. And the only thing that turns out that can't hurt you is virtue. If I just take that away as a self-help tool, and instead of chasing money and health, I just practice my virtue, that is permissible in Sextus's regime?
Yeah, no, great question, and I don't know the answer. I do think that it points to one of the really interesting, tensions, imperfections, deficits in Sextus's scheme, that he may not give sufficient weight to the continuity between
ordinary beliefs and dogma.
Ordinary beliefs and philosophical activities. That he may think he can partition the world into the philosophers and the non-philosophers, when in fact philosophy does spring from and is continuous with lots of relatively ordinary human activities.
Yeah, this is how I got into philosophy. I was a STEM kid growing up. I hated the humanities. I was definitely not interested in philosophy until I met with real-life challenges around recognition. I'm happy to be studying with some of the greatest recognition theorists whose philosophy...
facial recognition? Or
no, like Axel Honneth and Fred Neuhauser. Recognition theory, like from Hegel, Rousseau.
Got it.
And their theory just gave me a very practical guide to improve my life in the same way that, I don't know, a friend telling me to stop browsing social media comments would, right? And so that's exactly the thing I'm trying to push the Sextus on, which is that it's a lot more of a continuity, and it's not very clear where the cut is supposed to be.
I think that's right. Yeah, I don't think he has a good answer to that.
I see.
It's a sociologically interesting fact that when you look at Greek culture, there are people called philosophers, there are people not called philosophers. There does seem to be this continuity of behavior between them. On the non-philosophical end, the people in Greek culture who are acting non-philosophically are acting just the way that ordinary Americans, Chinese, anybody around the world acts. It's a puzzle why that developed in one direction in Greece and did not develop in the same direction in other countries. Why is it that the same informal instincts towards philosophizing that you find everywhere, you find anywhere in Africa,
practical deliberation,
practical deliberation, and a little bit of curiosity, wanting to figure out the world. Whatever the non-technical well springs of philosophy are, why did they develop in one way in the Greek context and not elsewhere?
So let's take a step back and talk about how a Sextan skeptic goes about forming his ordinary beliefs in everyday life.
Oh, so I mean, Sextus is going to refuse to offer any theory about that. Once we start talking about how we form beliefs, now we're forming meta-beliefs, and I'm trying to get out of the business because I don't think there are any good theories of meta-belief. So yeah, he's going to decline that.
Right, but that's why I asked you to tell us how a sexton forms beliefs.
Right. Well, again, I do it just the way that the grocery clerk does it. I don't have a theory about how the grocery clerk does it. The Aristotelians have a theory, but it's got a bunch of problems. The Stoics have a theory, and it's got a bunch of problems. And in fact, nobody knows how the grocery clerk does it. That's how I do it too.
I see. What I loved about this description of how he forms it is a negative point, as most of Sextus's interesting insights are, which is that you don't need a criterion to form a judgment. So I had this debate. One of my friends from undergrad, he's now doing a PhD in logic at Berkeley, at philosophy department, and he started grilling me about my beliefs, and he's like, "Do you believe there's a lamp there?" I'm like, "Yes, there does appear to be a lamp there." And then he's like, "Well, what is that justified on?"
Right.
You must be holding the idea that sense perception is valid. And what is that justified upon? And then he was trying to show that how I was either being circular in my reasoning or a foundationalist. And I was like, no, I just think there's a lamp there. like period. If you push me, I would say, yeah, I do think sense perception is useful and right most of the time. But I'm not holding the belief that there's a lamp there only because I'm holding the second belief that I believe sense perception is valid, right? And so that's kind of the intuition that we can get from Sextus as well.
Yeah, possibly. Now, the moves that your friend was trying to make are ones that he got, whether directly or indirectly, from Sextus. Right? So it's Sextus who tells us about the so-called Agrippin modes, an interlocking network of argumentative moves that are supposed to reduce anybody to a state of equipollence or of aporia, just not knowing what to do. And the opening moves are, as you said, somebody makes a claim, you ask them to justify it. They offer a justification, you ask them to justify that. Agrippa said, at every stage of this, one of three things is going to happen. They're going to cite a new justification, which they haven't mentioned before, but that way just lies infinite regress. They're going to cite some justification which came earlier, but that way lies circularity. Or they're going to claim that the thing itself is somehow self-justifying. They're going to claim, oh, this is self-evident, this is self-certifying. And if they do, then they're just declining to give any justification. Accordingly, the contradictory of that statement would have just as much justification as what they're claiming. I mean, if they say this is self-certifying, well, I can say the negation is self-certifying.
Right.
Why not? I mean, they haven't offered any justification. In fact, they're refusing to offer justification. So my unjustified contradiction has just as much justification as theirs. So this triple of regress, circularity, and what he calls hypothesis is intended to preclude the possibility of any satisfactory justification for anything, at which point Sextus says, following Agrippa, that we should accept the equipollence of all arguments. This is one of his so-called master arguments, which, again, many people think is so powerful that surely Sextus must have given up on the actual search for truth. Surely having used this...
Just as one argument is enough, right? It's a kind of foundational kind of attack,
This is why it's again, sometimes called a master argument. It's, he has a couple of these sort of master arguments that are all purpose, it's a fair question how we should respond to the Agrippin trilemma. In the history of philosophy, generally speaking, you can go coherentist. That's something like the circularity move. You can go foundationalist. That's something like the self-certifying move. Or you can go infinitist, and that's something like just embracing the idea of infinite regress, which some people do. Some people think you can make a positive epistemology out of that.
But the key thing is, after Sextus uses this three-part master argument, what he wants you to show is not that you're not justified in holding any belief. It's that you don't need to do this process of justification, right? That's the key thing I want to draw out. After doing this, he wants to show you, look, we don't need to figure out how you think there is a lamp there and whether it's foundationalist or infinitist or circular. We don't need that kind of justification for us to operate in ordinary life. Is that the right intuition?
So I think, he set out looking for it, and he claims he's still looking for it. And again, this is part of what makes Sextus tricky. He also seems to think that without it is possible to get tranquility, which was the ultimate end that he was seeking. Do we need it? I guess my only hesitation is that it might even be too dogmatic in his view to claim that we don't need it.
Right. Okay. What he would probably claim, I got to be really careful here when we talk about Sextus, is something like he doesn't need it to gain tranquility. He didn't need it to gain tranquility, at the very least. He's content going around with life not thinking that he's come up with a justification for why the hell he thinks a lamp is there.
That's how it turned out. Yeah, much to his surprise, it turned out that without being able to justify his views, he found tranquility all the same.
I see.
And he does recommend this to us. I mean, so there is a certain amount of generalization. It's not as though he only says, hey, this worked for me, but I can't say whether it will work for anyone else. He does seem to say, and you should try it at a minimum.
I see. You know what? I just realized I was being probably as dogmatic as my friend because my response to him was, no, I don't need justification. I just hold that belief for its own sake, period. But that is also explaining how the belief got there, right? I'm essentially giving a move and saying, no, I don't need any of this. This is how man operates. But that's not what Sextus is saying, because I'm offering a theory there in some sense.
I think
Sextus is simply saying, I haven't found the justification, and I'm fine living life without it, which is slightly different than what I was trying to say, right?
Yes, I think that's right. And it's not surprising that in a philosophical context, you felt pressed to respond with a philosophical response.
Right.
But Sextus would say that's not what he's doing. That's right.
I see. Let me give you another quote from your book. The Sextan skeptic contents himself with saying, not that a set of arguments are inadequate, but that he feels them to be inadequate. They produce no compelling persuasion in him. How does a Sextan skeptic go about improving his ordinary beliefs? Because we all do need to improve our ordinary beliefs, right? If I tell you, go left instead of right, and you find out that I'm a liar, it's an ordinary life, you would not trust that. So if it's, at the end of the day, it's just about, well, do I feel compelled? Like, surely there must be more, even for ordinary beliefs.
Yeah, no, it's a fair question, right? Does Sextus believe that there are resources in ordinary life to improve our beliefs, as you were saying, without a big theory? If there are, then he can help themselves to those things. How much improvement do the resources of ordinary life offer me? They'll probably offer me, as you were saying, guidance about avoiding liars and so on.
It's quite significant, in fact, I think, right? We all have to do this kind of practical reasoning about whether our beliefs are right. And,
yeah, that's right. However, there's a big question here, which I think is very important. Namely, does Sextus offer us the resources for anything like a systematic critique of a current state of society? And I think the answer is no. And this is something that I find troubling about Sextus, that lots of people find troubling about him. Living a conventional life, as he claims to do, makes you the prisoner of convention. In his case, that's going to mean things like accepting the naturalness of slavery, for instance. Why do we think slavery is fine? Well, because everybody thinks slavery is fine. That's a big problem. It's a systematic problem because what Sextus is giving up on is the idea of being able to find some independent perspective from which you could launch a critique of your own society. It means that he is going to be ultimately sort of quietistic, as the word goes. He's going to be a quietist about the problems in his own society. And that's a problem. Yeah. That's to me, a big black mark against Sextus's system as a whole.
Yeah, but there's something I think even simpler that I want to tease out, which is, again, let me flesh out this example. Let's say you say, Jonathan, let me buy this apple from you. I'm going to give you $5 tomorrow.
Right.
I hold my belief. Professor Brennan is going to give me $5 tomorrow. And another professor tells me, don't believe that guy. He's a liar. He told me the exact same. He told all our colleagues the exact same. He didn't get any of something. He just ran away with the apples.
Right.
Presumably, I think Sextus would say, I'm warranted in changing my belief that you are going to give me $5 tomorrow. And the question is, what are the valid modes of justification for a belief, right? And so even in conventional life, when it's not just about grand critiques of society like slavery, even when it's about my everyday life, I need to think about what beliefs are more justified and what's not, right? And so does Sextus give us any resources to do that?
No. And what he's probably going to say about it is not that you are justified on the basis of the testimony of all my peers in changing your belief and concluding that I'm not trustworthy, but rather just that you will. So it's an unexplained fact that in fact you will.
There's no normativity here. It's just descriptive. I felt compelled, and then if I say I felt compelled because it's 10 friends I trust versus this new guy who I don't know.
Right.
Would he allow me to say that? If I say, well, it's 10 guys I know, one guy I don't know.
Well, okay, so there's a difference, right? I mean, if you were to say, look, as a personal report, I'll tell you what happened. I heard a bunch of negative things, and I found I no longer trusted Brennan.
I see.
If you were to say, on the other hand, I've got a new principle. When trying to establish the veracity of different testimony, I weight up the number of testifiers, and I use the number of testifiers multiplied times a factor for, right now all of a sudden you're making a theory, and now all of a sudden he's going to say, yeah, sorry, is that the right theory?
Okay, but here's the issue, which is that in ordinary life, clearly certain justifications are wrong even when we think they are right. Like if I say, I saw a star in the night sky, which means that tomorrow Professor Brennan's going to kill me. That's just a completely wrong justification. In ordinary life, we say, we smack the person in the face, and then we say, no, that's not justified, even in ordinary life, right? So even in ordinary life, we have to investigate whether things are so much justified without positing some kind of fundamental theory, no?
So as a general matter, Sextus is going to have to accept the superstitions that are widely accepted in his own culture. He just doesn't have any resources to run counter to his own culture and his own upbringing.
But let's say that's just a idiosyncrasy. That's not my culture. Like I believe whenever the star streaks, someone's going to kill me. So surely you could say, no, that's crazy, Jonathan. Even in ordinary life.
Yeah, right. And clearly he can run some formal skeptical moves here. I mean, clearly he can say, the track record of astrology is very poor, and let me talk with you about, he actually has a book devoted to investigating the astrologers and the problems with their astrological theories. So he can treat your claim as eligible for skeptical attack. If he doesn't treat your claim as eligible for skeptical attack, but just takes it as an ordinary belief formation process, I don't know what resources he has. So for instance, imagine that you said this and your grandmother said, that's outrageous, smack, right? If you said, well, I guess she just felt outraged. I guess she just had a visceral reaction that this was nonsense, and that's why she smacked me. Then Sextus might say, oh yeah, visceral reactions, yeah, I have those. And I act on them sometimes too.
So what he wants to avoid from saying is saying, this is better or worse justified. He wants to get out of the normative realm. He just wants to talk purely about descriptive things. I felt compelled. I didn't feel compelled. You felt compelled. You didn't feel compelled. He doesn't want to say you felt compelled and that's wrong, because that necessarily means positing some kind of theory. Even though we do that in ordinary life. So again, I'm trying to show that ordinary life, ordinary justification in life and philosophical justification seems a lot more blurred than Sextus.
I completely agree with this. I completely agree with this general point that he helps himself to an imaginary divide that's really not there. I should also say that if Sextus were to say, I slapped the kid because of a visceral reaction, that's what Granny does too. That would probably pass muster as a Sexton move. If you then said to him, so Sextus, do you have a theory about the justificatory status of visceral feelings? He would say, no, I don't want to go there. Right? I'm not going to develop a new theory of the visceral. Right? That's not what I'm doing. Right. So again, what you find is at every turn, the inclination to systematize ordinary practice makes the ordinary practice topple over into philosophy. So Maybe ordinary people would just respond from a visceral gut feeling.
Right.
That's fine. But once you take the visceral gut feeling and say, aha, a new foundation for epistemology, gut feelings. Oh, great. Now we're doing philosophy, and now Sextus is going to object.
And my response, and I think you're agreeing here, is pushing him to say, no, people do a lot more philosophy than he makes it seem.
Absolutely.
And let me give you another quote from your book.
Okay. Yeah.
Both Socrates and the skeptic share an important presupposition that the judgments made in accordance with convention should not be overruled except by a complete, fully worked out system that is demonstrably capable of eliminating the present anomalies without introducing new ones. Is that a dogma in some way? Because that's an extremely high bar to want to supersede convention. This goes back to your slavery point. It seems enough to say, look, this is unjust. Look at all the terrible things. I don't need a theory of everything before we overthrow slavery.
Right. Right.
Why does he need something so epistemically strong before he's willing to challenge convention? Suddenly, convention appears to be another dogma.
Yes, and convention is winning a lot of fights by default. So I agree that these are both ethical and epistemological shortcomings in Sextus's theory. He's giving the status quo, the default, much too much freedom and leeway, and giving any new challenger much too hard of a time. So I agree with that.
Right. But why hold that extreme standard, right? Think about something like, we believe the earth is flat. And I say, no, well, I got a ship, I just sailed directly ahead, and I ended up in this exact same place. I don't have a grand theory about how the earth is round and, how people can face this way and face that way, because I don't know about gravity, or the solar system. Why do I need an entire systematic worldview before you're willing to correct this one thing from convention? That's my question. Why hold that high of an epistemic bar?
I agree with you that Sextus does not seem to me to be motivated adequately or justified in saying that any alteration from convention, any deviation from convention, requires a complete system. What I would say is this: if he talks that way, and I think he does, it's because typically he's encountering philosophers who want to tweak convention as the result of their belief that they do possess the big theory. So most of his opponents think that they do have the big theory, and it's on that basis that they are justified in overriding the current conventions. They're justified in introducing real novelties, really counterintuitive theories, because of the success of their big theory. So that's not that's, as it were, kind of a contextual answer. It's why he acts that way. It's why that's the typical high bar that he sets up, because that's the high bar that his opponents advertise.
I see. It's the imminent critique part, right? He's saying, this is what you claim you need. I'm going to show you how it doesn't get there.
Typically, that's right. So if he were to meet a different opponent, the kind that you're describing, where the person would say, I want to deviate from convention in a relatively minor way. I don't have a whole theory, but I think we can make piecemeal improvements. It's not clear to me what Sextus would say at that point. I mean, I think in part we've already discussed the Agrippan trilemma. So part of what he would say would be, okay, well, how do you justify that deviation? Is it as part of a broader theory? If not, is it just a one-off unjustified deviation? So he might go in that direction. But I agree with you that that quote does contrast a small change to convention with a very high bar for the system.
Here's my last question / critique of this whole idea of convention, which is that there is no single thing called convention. I mean, this is evident in today's cosmopolitan world, right? When the world was one. But even in his time, right? I imagine there were, for example, in the civil wars in Rome, right? There were senators who were Epicureans. There were senators who were Stoics, right? Cato. There were senators who were skeptics, like Cicero, and that philosophical difference, went down to a lot of society. So there is no core of convention. So where does he even get that from?
Yeah, no, fair. And in his view, a delightful fact about the society he lives in, that there are lots of competing conventions, because then that allows him to launch more skeptical arguments and say, for instance, oh, the Greeks think that incest is terrible, but if you look at the Egyptian royal family, it's a convention among them to have incestuous marriages. So I'm going to counterpose one set of conventions to another set in order to say convention itself cannot provide us a foundation for epistemology either. So he's well aware that there are many competing conventions.
I see, but he uses that to attack convention as dogma.
Yeah.
He just defaults to whatever he wants, and if you ask them why, he's just saying, "Well, I felt like it," right? That's all he's going to say.
There's too much of that. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, and I agree. This is unsatisfactory. As a historian of philosophy, I have two hats, right? So I'm trying to figure out what these people said. I have the hat of sympathetic advocate, trying to make as much sense out of it as I can. I've also got the hat of neutral assessor, right? Critical assessment. Where at some point in the day, I've got to say, yeah, I've given it my best shot, and it falls short. I've tried to make the system as comprehensible, as sympathetic as possible, but it's got some problems.
I see.
And I think you've done a good job finding some of them.
Great,
I agree.
So we talked about the why he attacks these theories. We talked about the what he's actually trying to attack. Now let's talk about the how. So what he's trying to get you to is equipollence, right? This idea of suspension of beliefs. So it's not that you believe both of them, it's that you find neither of them plausible because they seem equally likely or something like that, but opposed. What are the methods that he uses to get us to equipollence?
He'll do anything, basically. He will oppose an argument to an argument. He'll oppose an argument to an impression. He'll oppose impressions to impressions. He'll oppose any two things to each other if they will bring about this equality of credibility and incredibility, as he says. So they're going to be equally believable and equally unbelievable by the time he's done with this. And he does, in a way, think that that he's always going to be opposing one argument to another. So, when he sums up his position, he'll say the skeptical method is to every argument to oppose another argument.
Although, in just the examples you gave, there seems to be different categories of arguments he uses. So, for example, this master argument you described of Agrippa,
right?
That to me seems to be a way to cut against almost all arguments, right? Because it's about the nature of justification. It's almost like the Cartesian demon.
Yep.
Well, I can use that on anything you say, right? Democracy is good. Well, how do you know a demon hasn't tricked our mind into believing it's good?
Right.
There are other times where he seems to just give you the direct opposite of that. So I say democracy is good. You give me Plato's attack on democracy and defense of aristocracy, right? So there seems to be different categories of arguments to induce this equipollence. Can you elaborate on
that's fair,
what that
right?
is?
So so sometimes it'll be a very direct confrontation of two opposing conventions. I mentioned earlier the bit about incest, right? Some folks say incest is good. Some folks say incest is bad. Well, I guess we can't decide, right? So that's pretty low level and easy. The Agrippan modes are more complicated. Presumably, the way that you use those to induce equipollence, instead of just complete aporia, is to run them on both the position and its negation.
Sorry, aporia in this case is disbelief.
Aporia would just be the inability to make any progress. So complete perplexity, just not knowing what to think.
I see. So, sorry, how is that different from equipollence?
Imagine that we run the Agrippan trilemma on someone, and they conclude, geez, I don't know how to justify my view. I'm still inclined to hold it, but I now have to confess that I can't justify it in any of these ways. And they might just feel perplexed about it, not know what to say, but not feel equipollence yet. So the aporia, the sense of being at a loss, need not be a symmetrical position.
Right.
We can induce symmetry, though, I think, is how he would do it, if we were to run the same sequence of arguments on the contradictory of that view.
I see.
So that's how we would bring into equipollence the equal plausibility and implausibility of two opposed statements. That's what we're always trying to do.
Right.
So if we've got a master argument like the Agrippan argument, which we can apply to one argument.
I see. You must also apply it to or you ought to, or he does apply it to the other.
Right.
Because otherwise you just have a sense of perplexity.
Well, so for instance, imagine that I applied the Agrippan trilemma to somebody's claim they believe in God. Well, then I might reduce them to a state of not believing in God. But that's not the end result I want. I don't want them to now have the view that God doesn't exist. Right. I want them to be in a state of equipollence. So now I'm going to have to run the same Agrippan trilemma on the view that there is no God.
Right.
Okay, so there's no God. How do you justify that? Okay, now I can get equipollence between there is a God and there is no God.
Why isn't these master arguments by themselves sufficient? Because you can just run the Agrippan argument if you think it holds on everything and its opposite, and it would work almost every time insofar as they're propositional arguments. Like, why does he need all this other stuff if there's these master arguments against everything?
Yeah, right. I'll mention another master argument, which I think is either very good or laughably bad. He says at some point, we sometimes oppose an argument in the present to an argument in the past. For instance, when we resurrect some argument from centuries ago, sometimes we oppose it to an argument in the future. For instance, when I, as a skeptic, don't have any good counter-argument to your position, what I'll say is this. Prior to the founding of your school, people didn't have any of the arguments that you have for your position. Well, at some future time, there may be a perfectly adequate counter-argument to your current position.
Right.
So you should suspend judgment in the face of some possible future counter-argument, which I don't even have handy to me. Right? So the argument from any future possible counter-argument is one of these master arguments, right, where he can always use this. Again, it's either clever or laughably bad. I don't know quite what to say. Why isn't that sufficient? Why aren't the master arguments sufficient? Well, one thing that he says towards the end of the first book of the Outlines is that because he's trying to induce strict equipollence, he's going to use arguments of all different grades of strength. If you hold a position weakly,
like a seesaw, right.
He's going to use a weak argument. If you hold it strongly, he'll use a strong argument. And he wants to have a whole inventory of arguments of all different strengths in order to be able to induce exact equipollence no matter whom he faces.
I see. His toolbox is a lot more robust than the modern skeptics, which just goes, well, the demon tricking you. He's willing to set up equipollence at any level. So if you say democracy is good, he might respond by running it through Agrippa's thing. He might give Plato's direct argument to set up a political philosophy equipollence. He has all these different tools available.
The important thing in his mind is to induce equality of credibility and incredibility, because that's what, in his experience, leads to tranquility.
Right.
So if you want that exact equality, you've got to be willing to use bad arguments as well as good ones.
Right, okay.
That's at least his claim.
This is where I have issue with equipollence, one of the many places, which is this exact idea of symmetry. Because let me posit a theory. Inside every atom, there is a little blue genie pedaling the atom around like a bicycle. And because they don't want humans to find them, they have an anti-human deflector shield.
Good.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's totally coherent to everything that we've investigated because of the human deflector shield.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Like, can he really set up an equipollence there? Like, if I say this iPad metaphysically are atoms versus this iPad is a cat metaphysically. Can he really set up equipollence in these arguments?
You don't need to deny the prima facie greater plausibility of the absence of demons. But what you can say is, I think, that if somebody tries to definitively establish the absence of blue demons, they're going to have a hard time of it. So here we've got the one person who says there are blue demons in every atom. They're going to have a hard time establishing that. Here's the other person who says, I can definitively establish the absence of blue demons in atoms. They're going to have a hard time establishing
An equally hard time? An equally hard time.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I mean, how would you set about establishing the absence, especially since you gave them human shield?
Okay, maybe if I wanted to absolutely establish it, it would be equipollence. But when I posit this theory, I can posit it in a dogmatic but non-absolute way, right? I can give you this whole explanation because Plato's forms is not dogmatic. He's kind of like, like in the laws, right? He seems to walk back a lot of the forms, but that seems to be something he wants to attack, right? So if all that he can attack with equipollence are like absolute certainties, then that seems to be not that interesting, if that makes sense.
Well, so that is the upshot of my earlier characterization of dogma.
Right.
I mean, that is, my claim was the best way to make sense of Sextus' system is that he's only interested in attacking dogma. I mean, he says that, and that by dogma, what he means is beliefs that are held as though they have a certain status in the ultimate theory of everything. To the extent that Plato doesn't hold his theory of forms that way, Sextus would not be interested in attacking that either. Plato's, his own writings vary. Sometimes he seems more confident than others. The Platonic school also varies. Some of Plato's followers were more gung-ho on forms than others. But Sextus is interested in attacking the gung-ho folks. I mean, he's interested in attacking the people who really do think they've got at least a page out of the ultimate book of everything. And this part's not going to be revisable.
When I give a completely outrageous claim, just to tempt the Sextus skeptic,
right?
Is it always a kind of foundational equipollence he's going to respond to me in, or can he also have an argument on the level of the claim, right? Directly arguing, no, eating feces is better than eating meat and vegetables. Right? Because I can see how you can always just go to the foundation in a Cartesian way and say, hey, how do you know a demon's not tricking you?
Right.
That's it.
Right.
These master arguments. But is he able to set up equipollence on the substantive level as well?
Yeah, I think he does. I mean, I think that's going to be his opening moves. Again, take the incest case. I mean, so somebody comes along and says incest is bad. His opening move will be, well, look, there's this whole culture where they say incest is fine.
Right.
Now, if that leaves his audience in equipollence, he's done his job. That's the end of the story.
I see.
He doesn't have to go further into the nature of human relations, genetics, etc., which he could go into if they're more resistant, right? If they don't arrive at equipollence with the easy opposition of one convention to another, then he's got more moves, but he doesn't need to make those moves.
I see. And so if I give an completely outrageous claim, and that he can't find like an incest example to balance it out, then he might have to go into a more foundational level to like human nature. Maybe he can find something there. And then he might have to go even further down to metaphysics, epistemology. Yep. And importantly, the claim isn't, I can always find equipollence. It's, I've always been able to.
Yeah,
right. That's the clear distinction.
Oh yeah, no. So that is one of his escape clauses, is that he's only reporting his own experience. He's not making predictions about the future. Right. These are some of the ways that he tries to safeguard himself against the charge of dogma. Right.
I see. And what about that concern you mentioned in the beginning of the interview, that when he's doing these logical moves, for example, non-contradiction, that seems to be something he needs to rely on. Is that an issue?
Yeah. So again, I think there too, as with many moves in Sextus, he's going to say, "Yeah, I don't need to be committed to it. It's sufficient that my opponents are committed to it. It's sufficient that they care about non-contradiction in order to launch an imminent critique. Me, I don't have views about this."
Right. Okay. So we talked about the why. We talked about the what. We talked about the how. Equipollence. I want to go back to the ethical consequences of this, is that he actually wins his tranquility. And he can't tell us how this happens,
right?
But in your book you mentioned it's from dropping this idea that you need capital T truth for tranquility. That's at least one of the key things. Like he just realized, after he set up all this kind of equipollence one day, he realized, wait a second, I do feel quite tranquil now. Hold on, I don't need capital truth for tranquility.
That's the claim. Yeah.
So that's the self-report of how this happened. Is that right?
Yeah, I think we have to assume that he's at least recommending this to the rest of us as well.
Right.
So there is a self-report, and he does say that that as a philanthropic type, right? He's a lover of humanity. He's recommending this to the rest of us as well.
Right.
So there's at least a provisional claim that others may experience this same experience.
Right. I deeply relate to this because in my first metaphysics class, I was like extremely bothered by the fact that I couldn't figure out whether it was atoms, whether it was an idealist.
Sure.
And then, as I got older, I'm like, I don't need to know that stuff to live a good life, right?
I see. Okay.
And so I deeply relate to this. However, here's the question, or maybe the challenge of whether it's reproducible in others, which is that the Sexton skeptic actually ends his journey where ordinary people who don't get into philosophy kind of begin their journeys, right? Because the sexton is almost like an alcoholic, but for philosophy, who's gotten past his addiction. Right? That's kind of, he thought he needed this grand theory, he's over it. However, that characterization is right, that he ends up returning to what an ordinary person is like. Ordinary people aren't tranquil.
Right.
So where does his tranquility come from, right? That's the concern.
Two concerns. Is he right that ordinary people are tranquil? Second of all, even if he's right, wasn't that a lot of wasted effort to get back to where he started from? Fair. So he actually explicitly says that his goal is tranquility in respect of philosophical dogmas and metriopatheia, that is a moderate amount of disturbance, moderate tranquility, moderate disturbance, in regard to the unavoidable facts of life. So what he's going to say in response to your objection is, yeah, it's true that ordinary people are not experiencing pure tranquility, but they experience no more disturbance than the facts of life impose on them. And that's what I experience as well. So I experience complete tranquility with respect to philosophical claims. I agree with you that ordinary people don't experience complete tranquility because the facts of life impose some disturbance. They impose that on me too. So I'm in the same position as ordinary people. We both experience a certain amount of disturbance, a certain amount of tranquility, metriopatheia, an intermediate experience with things like hunger, disease, and so on. Yeah, it's a rough life. But what I don't feel is any of the self-imposed disturbance that the philosophers put on themselves.
Right, I see. And this is why the context was so important, the characters you drew out initially, which is that there was a lot of self-imposed consequences.
That's at least what he thinks.
In your reading, he's just back to normal, like identical to an ordinary person who understands a lot of philosophical arguments on both sides.
That seems to be the sole gain. He is a lot more conversant with philosophy. He may not have any temptation to think that philosophy is necessary to get to the next stage. This then goes back into the question of, is he really sincerely searching for the truth anymore? Because he says he is. But you might think, if he's gone through all this, found tranquility, and now is in the state that he started from, why is he still looking?
And it's even weirder because every time he's pulled up an argument, he's found it to be unjustified in the sense that the argument itself claims it to be justified. So it's like, I don't know, doing business with one person, keep getting cheated every single time, and then going back regardless. So he's got what he wanted for, tranquility. He's been disappointed every time he's been searching for truth. Why keep pursuing this?
Right. So it's a triumph of hope over experience. If he really is searching for the truth. I mean, that is, if he really does wake up every day saying, hey, maybe today I'll find the truth. Better keep looking. So that's one possible motivation for his ongoing efforts, is that he thinks that the truth is still worth searching for, and he still associates himself with the philosophical search for truth. That's part of his self-identity. Another possibility is the philanthropic motive, that he wants to bring enlightenment to others, roughly. That he has attained enlightenment, but he still is engaged in this activity. He's still writing these books so that he can help other people make the same move. And that's at least a possible motivation for him.
Right. Or he just likes doing philosophy.
Or he likes doing philosophy. It's a very strange picture. We know nothing about his life. We don't even really know when he lived within 50 years. We don't know where he lived. We don't know. It seems he probably was a professional doctor, just from his nickname. Empiricus would have meant a member of the medical school of empiricism. But what we do see is apparently a solitary scholar. He never refers to anybody that he's in live conversation with. He's just sitting in a library arguing with dead people. He's just arguing with hundreds of years old philosophical positions, some of which no longer have live representatives. These are schools that died out a long time ago. It's a very strange picture, and it's very hard to know what his life was like and why he engaged in it as he did.
On top of his name, I do think that a great branding opportunity was lost when we decided to call his philosophy Sexten and not Sexy.
Sexy, no, that's true. That's true.
That would be a much better adjective, yes.
Absolutely.
So here's the last question I have on ethics, which is this claim that he rejected. You need capital T truth to induce tranquility. Why isn't there an equipollence set up there? I mean, the kind of proposition I'm thinking is, if you don't get capital T truth, you're going to get punished in some severe way, whether that's in the afterlife. Like, because he hasn't shown that not to be true, right?
Right.
I get Sextus's position if he says, I looked at all the afterlife theories, kind of like the Epicureans. It's not going to happen. This is the life. I don't have to worry about, any gods zapping me. This is what a lot of the Epicurean atomism was trying to do, right? To say that there's no gods or there's no gods that will interfere with us and zap us.
Right.
But that's not the position he's got at. He hasn't figured out the foundations of reality. So why is there that tranquility still?
Yeah. Well, again, it's a self-report, and that's compatible with his saying that for all he knows, he will not be tranquil tomorrow. For all he knows, he will be punished in the future. For all he knows, he'll feel deep distress tomorrow. I see. Right. Lack tranquility.
He's not
tomorrow.
in the business of giving an explanation. He's just saying, "Hey, this happened. I'm tranquil now. Good luck."
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, and again, that's always in tension with his claim that as a philanthropist, he wants to help other people to do this as well. Because that seems to imply some, at least inchoate predictions that this will happen for other people. It seems to imply some minimal prediction that it will work tomorrow and the day after that, which he really shouldn't be able to help himself to. So there is a problem, I don't think a resolvable problem, between his claim that all this has the status of mere self-report, I'm just telling you what happened to me, and his saying, and you should try it too.
Right, I see, right. Because your intuition is that he's saying something slightly stronger in the second.
When he recommends it to others, and when he describes himself as doing this philanthropically, then he's moving beyond self-report.
I see. Sextus was obviously in a line of what we call Pyrrhonian skeptics. Can you tell us a bit about this school and what Sextus added to it, if any?
Yeah. Well, so it's only because of Sextus that we have any solid grasp of a Pyrrhonian school. We have some anecdotes from a different author, Diogenes Laertius, about a historical guy named Pyrrho, but they're very thin. There's almost no philosophical content to them. Apparently there was a guy named Pyrrho. He was wandering around in 600 years prior in the 4th century BC and seemed to claim to live without beliefs. But all we have are a few anecdotes that his followers prevented him from falling off cliffs, which to me always struck me, as a horrible cheat. I mean, what's the point of having the master say, "I have no beliefs," and then having his acolytes prevent him from the consequences of his own views? So that's about as much as we know about Pyrrho. He didn't write anything. He had one follower, Timon, who wrote some poems that glorified Pyrrho, but again, very little philosophical content. As far as I can tell, he was not a philosopher at all. He was kind of a lifestyle influencer. He was somebody who led a life that people found intriguing and curious, but not a philosopher. It's Sextus and maybe one or two people before Sextus who took over the name of Pyrrho in order to characterize their new philosophical stance. And they're actually doing philosophy. Why did they pick that name? That's a matter of conjecture. Some people have conjectured it's because they wanted to set aside the phrase academic that they were trying to distinguish themselves from, namely the negative dogmatism of saying that knowledge is impossible.
Right.
So they're actually academics of a sort, but they're going to say, no, the academics, they're the ones who say that knowledge is impossible. We need a new label for ourselves. Let's call ourselves Pyrrhonians. There's this guy, there's not much known about him.
So this is almost like a branding thing.
It's a branding thing.
It wasn't this school like Plato's Academy that had this lineage. It was Sextus, some guys before him who developed a theory and just wanted to differentiate themselves. Essentially.
That's I think, a plausible hypothesis. Now, there's almost no evidence for it. I mean, this is really a conjectural reconstruction of moves and maneuvers within the schools.
Right.
But it is very hard otherwise to figure out why they call themselves Pyrrhonians. As you said, there is no enduring legacy from the historical Pyrrho.
I see. And let's talk a bit about the academic skeptics,
Yeah.
so I'm reading Cicero right now, and
Oh,
Cicero
great.
is a self-identified academic skeptic.
Absolutely.
And so the intuition is, take everything we've discussed today, and instead of drawing the optimistic, hopeful Sexton conclusion that, maybe tomorrow I'll get the truth, you just draw the relatively normal inductive conclusion. It's probably not out there. It's probably not out there. And you get the academics. Is that roughly right?
So this too is a matter of controversy. I think there's a very plausible reading of academic skepticism, according to which they were closer to Sextus than Sextus himself wants to admit.
Right.
And how does this work? Well, roughly the idea is that what the skeptics denied is not what Sextus says they denied. Sextus says they declared that knowledge was impossible. Really what they declared was that the Stoic theory of knowledge was not satisfiable. So the Stoics have a very concrete, determinate account of what knowledge consists in. The Stoics spent a lot of time working this out. It's very elaborate and interesting. And the academics spent their time targeting the Stoics and saying, that doesn't work. To the extent that that's knowledge, there's no knowledge, because there's none of that available. Now, that's compatible with the academics saying, if knowledge is something else than the Stoics say, then yeah, maybe there's knowledge. Sure, could well be. We're just arguing with the Stoics.
I see.
At which point, they're much closer to Sextus in being primarily ad hominem, dialectical against a particular school.
Offensive, right.
Yeah.
And at least in some readings of probabilism that developed later in academic skepticism, they seem to be even more willing to engage in theory than Sextus, right? To say, look, I don't know if Plato is right. He seems the most probable. So we're going to roughly work with that. Is that fair?
So again, these are controversies among interpreters. At least one theory of the academic stance was that what they meant by the probable was not a probability measure, either this is 70% or even this is more probable than that, but rather, again, a kind of a self-report about what they were left with after examining all the arguments. So I looked at a bunch of arguments pro and con, and I find that, the upshot is that I actually do think this. Now, this is a self-report. I think this. There's some connection between my thinking this and my having examined arguments pro and con, but I don't claim that the residual position that I end up with is necessarily justified by the arguments that led me to get there. I'm just persuaded. And is my persuasion a justification? No, it's just a self-reported persuasion.
I see. So take what Sextus says about, I feel compelled, and apply it to certain theories.
Right.
That's kind of the intuition.
The upshot would be that the academic skeptic is not reporting that A is more probable than B, but that after having examined A and B very thoroughly, they just find themselves feeling B, feeling A, whichever it might be. They've just found that to be more convincing in whatever sense.
I see.
So again, there's a way, not only is it a branding exercise, but it, as most branding exercises will be, is probably inaccurate. That the distance between the academics and Sextus was probably a lot less than Sextus wanted to say it was.
I see. Let's do one last comparison between ancient and modern Cartesian skepticism. And let's use the skepticism of Sextus. Tell us about what you think the biggest differences are.
Well, so, as you know, Descartes' skepticism is merely methodological. It's merely a technique he uses to get down to what he thinks are the genuine, secure, and unquestionable foundations, after which he'll be able to erect the new scaffolding of Cartesian science. Right. So he's not a skeptic in any sense. He just
starting point
employs skepticism in order to get rid of some false beliefs and in order to be able to find out what is really secure, what is unquestionably secure, by subjecting everything to this sort of corrosive skeptical doubt and seeing what survives. And what survives, as you know, is the cogito, and then you go from there on up, right? Then you get God, and then you get everything else, and great, all of a sudden you've got a vast positive network of Renaissance science. So that's one of the big differences, is just that Descartes is merely a methodological skeptic in this respect. So far as the particular arguments go, there are very few arguments in Descartes that are not already in Sextus. Descartes had read Sextus and had read secondhand accounts. I mean, Sextus is rediscovered early in the Renaissance, makes a huge splash, and just shockwaves all over Europe when this stuff is rediscovered. Descartes is also deeply influenced by Augustine, and Augustine was familiar with the academic skeptics, and so some of Descartes' arguments derive more from Augustine's encounters with academic skeptics. Augustine wrote a whole treatise, Contra Academicos, against the academic skeptics, in which Augustine rehearses academic skeptical arguments, he rehearses his arguments against them, and Descartes is relying a lot on this. So, one big difference is just that Sextus and Augustine did it first, and Descartes is a copycat. So that's, one sort of difference. There's, again, I think very little original in Descartes.
Yeah. And because for Descartes it's only methodological, it's to serve his greater end of a positive theory, not only does Sextus do it first, he does it better in the sense that he has more toolkits in his tool belt, because that's what he was trying to do, right? He was trying to get people to equipollence.
I think there that Descartes thought he had a master argument, not a master skeptical argument, but a master anti-skeptical argument in the Cogito.
Right.
And so his view was, I'm going to do skepticism enough to destabilize my audience, enough to destabilize their reliance on their sense perception.
I'm going to rescue them, right?
And then I'll rescue them, exactly, with my Cogito, and then start the process of rebuilding. Yeah.
Last question I want to ask, which is kind of a psychological ad hominem kind of question, which is, I find Nietzsche's ad hominem and psychological attacks to be, if not right, deeply revealing about certain philosophies, like why certain kinds of people are attracted to certain philosophies. I find myself most attracted to skepticism when I'm being lazy or when I'm being slothful. So I had a literal miracle experience. I can tell you all about it later. Where I'm pretty sure I witnessed a Christian miracle, having interviewed a Yale professor called Carlos Eyre, who wrote a historical book about Christian miracles. And I'm not a Christian, I'm somewhat of a seeker. The first thing I did was to look up all the Buddhist miracles to try to set myself up to a state of equipollence, because I didn't have to do all the no sex before marriage, like Lent and all that stuff. And
you were concerned that the miracle might convince you to be a Christian, just on the basis of having witnessed the miracle.
Yeah, sure. Right. You witnessed a miracle. And so I immediately caught myself doing all the sexton techniques.
Okay.
Because I didn't want the practical consequences of that kind of commitment. The kind of commitment, perhaps, that led to some of the caricatural negative consequences, but it can lead to also positive consequences, right? The real kind of commitment to a philosophy.
Sure. Being a diehard Christian is no laughing matter.
Exactly. And it can be very positive, it can be negative. Dante, I believe, puts the people who can't decide, I think, as the first people you meet. I think they're outside the gates of hell. But anyways, did you see that as a viable concern, that this is a philosophy for people who are kind of non-committal and kind of slothful, or tends to that?
Non-committal as a flaw in their character. I have so much independent evidence that I am lazy, slothful, and non-committal. There's no need to infer it from my philosophical interests. That's really sort of superfluous. Does this appeal to people who don't want to be committed? I think you can argue on either side of this, right? I mean, that is, you can also argue that arriving at a conviction produces a great sense of rest. Oh, thank goodness, I don't have to keep on seeking.
I see.
Whereas the constant investigation is actually more demanding. It's actually more rigorous to keep on questioning, keep on probing. Look at Henry James on the formation of belief. He thinks that curiosity is a kind of unsatisfied itch, and belief formation scratches that itch. And it returns us to a state of relative tranquility, because we no longer have that dissatisfaction of curiosity. So you could say that the skeptics are people who are not lazy. They are willing to remain in this perpetual state of being on edge. You can never rest. You can never take a day off. You've always got to be investigating, which is why it would not describe me at all. Right. So I mean,
for you, the ad hominem lands.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Right. So again,
So
What about Sextus? He was not a lazy dude. I mean, he clearly was very hardworking. He wrote just a ton of stuff. He worked hard at it, and he wrote a lot. He was, productive.
I think non-committal is more right than lazy, but I love what you said there, perhaps partially because it justifies my own actions. But I genuinely do think, like, when I caught myself doing that,
right,
and I said, wait, hold on, is this just me not wanting the commitment of a Christian life? I was genuinely moved by the equipollence of the evidence for Buddhist miracles.
Right.
That set up a proper equipollence with the Christian one.
Right.
So it wasn't like I was like, oh, someone over there told me that they saw a guy flying around and versus here it has like concrete evidence. It was that the evidence is actually really, really good.
Right.
And only then, because you are right, in some sense I am seeking because I want to find the answer about what the hell happens to us after we die.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it does require a kind of, I don't want to be too self-congratulatory, kind of courage to be willing to sit in that suspension and to say, no, I don't know. And perhaps even more courage like Sextus to say, and I'm going to keep on searching.
Yeah, so I don't think it has to be lazy. I mean, you can do it in a lazy way, witness me, but you can also do it in a self-challenging, rigorous way that, the same way somebody goes to the gym to keep on trying to improve. And that's a possibility too.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor, for a fascinating interview.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah, good.
Thanks for watching my interview. If you want to go even deeper into these ideas, then join my email list at jonathanb.com. You'll not only get full-length episodes, but also transcripts, book notes, and invitations to future lectures. Now, if you like this interview, I actually filmed 2 more with Professor Brennan on Stoicism that I think you should also check out. You can find links to those interviews and everything we covered today in the description, as well as on my website, jonathanb.com. Thank you.